Hello, everybody. I think we are waiting for somebody else to join us still. But I'll go ahead and get started. So, thank you, everybody, for joining me. My name is Autumn Tolle Jackson. I am an author. I wrote my memoir called Boldly Into the Darkness: Living with Loss, Growing with Grief, and Holding On to Happiness. And more than that, I'm somebody who's grieved. Unfortunately, well, I guess let's start from the beginning. So I was really blessed growing up that I did not have to deal with grief. The biggest situation of grief that I had to deal with was the loss of great grandparents and grandparents that I barely had a relationship with. And as sad as that was for me, um, you know, it didn't affect my daily life. I probably felt the loss of a horse when I was in high school worse than that. And so I didn't know how to grieve. I didn't know what grief was. And what I found was I didn't know I was grieving until after I had already been grieving for a very long time. So my first experience with grief was miscarriages, which is something that nobody talks about. And you always hear when you have a miscarriage, you hear that, well, 1 in 4 women have a miscarriage. You're not alone. But I didn't know that. So I went through it by myself. And I didn't want to bring my husband into it because I didn't understand that he would grieve. And so I went through it by myself. And then when I was 31 and my husband was 30, and we had a 3-year-old and we had a newborn, he went for a jog and he literally dropped dead. They have no idea why. His heart stopped. I found him on the side of the road. Despite CPR, despite life-saving efforts from the EMTs, there was no reviving him. We never did figure out what had happened. So that was a pretty big introduction into grief. It was something I didn't see coming. I had my life planned out. I was a big planner. I knew exactly what was going to happen in the next 5 years, what our life was going to look like. And all of a sudden I was all alone. And the life that I had pictured wasn't even like a possibility at all. So I had to completely change what I had expected. And that was in 2015. And that year, for a grief introduction year, started off with a bang, and then it kept going. So later in the year, my cousin, who was very much more like a sister ended up in the hospital with issues nobody knew she had. She ended up having a tumor. And by the time they diagnosed the tumor, it was too late and she was declared brain dead in her mid-30s. And then a few months later, my grandpa passed away from cancer that we had all thought he was in remission from. And so it was just one loss after another loss after another loss. And where I'm from is in a very rural area in Eastern Oregon. And so we get a lot of pull yourself up by the bootstraps, carry on, move on with your life. It happens. You have to deal with it. Be strong. You have to be strong for your kids. A lot of those things that everybody hears. But in the culture, very much, you're supposed to just deal with it. No big deal. And so I tried and I did it and I pretended and I did the best I could. And I don't remember most of that time because I was very much in grief and I was in the shock of grief. And then I was able to find somebody who really helped me grieve, and he became my grieving person, and eventually he became my husband, and we added a third child to our family. And her name was Riley, and she was amazing. And for 3 months, everything was perfect. And then she got a cold, which resulted in her going into cardiac arrest. And while they were able to resuscitate her, she was declared brain dead. And she was 3 months old. And so how do you, again, you're thrust into this loss. And at that point, I'd known I'd been grieving. I grieved for my husband. I grieved for these other things, but I was just trying to get away from the emotions because sometimes it's so overwhelming and it's so hard to think about. But I knew I needed to do something different. And so I started talking about my grief a lot more. I started opening up more to people. I started sharing. And what I found was, well, yeah, it's hard to talk about it and it's hard to face it, that there was actually a lot of healing in doing that. So, the title of our session is Boldly Into the Darkness, The Benefits of Facing Your Feelings. And can you guys see my slides? So let me make those so you can see them. There they are. It's like magic. Thank you. And so my book is also titled Boldly Into the Darkness. And for me, what that means is you really have to go into the darkness. You have to go into that painful place of hurt and really deal with whatever you're feeling, whatever it is, in order to find the light. And there's a really amazing song by a group called American Aquarium. And as part of the chorus, they say, go boldly into the darkness and be the light. Be the light for other people, be the light for yourself. And so I really had kind of grasped onto that and found a lot of comfort in it. And through some of my own counseling sessions, learned the benefits of it. It's not an easy thing to do. And I'd heard throughout my grief process, just sit with your feelings, feel your feelings, just do this. And I'm like, I have feelings. I know they exist. What does that mean? I don't know what that means. And so I wanted to take the time to really define what it meant to me. And I think it's important that everybody defines what it means for themselves as well. So I'd like to take just a minute and open it up to the other people that have joined me in this workshop. And if you could just introduce yourself a little bit, and if you're comfortable, share a little bit of your grief journey or what your loss is. And then talk to me, or maybe a sentence or two about what you think facing your feelings or sitting in your feelings means to you. And I guess if nobody wants to volunteer, I'll start calling on people.
I was going to say, do we want to just work down the rows? But I don't know if all of our little happy squares are in the same order.
I was going to
do in the middle on my screen.
Why don't you go first, since you went ahead and unmuted, Allison?
I was going to say, Sarah's above me on my screen, but the Hollywood squares.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I'm Allison Pilling. I guess I reside in Belleville, Ontario, Canada. And I was invited into this global grief conference, actually by Jenny Diltz here, who has joined this panel as well. I'm a life coach and an author and a doTERRA wellness advocate. And I would say I try and put words around what I do exactly. And I'd say I teach people simple to follow techniques in releasing fears so that they can take empowered action. And what sort of really pushed me into the world of grief is my husband passed away in 2016. And ever since then, actually, the title of your workshop today is perfect because I'm pretty sure, like, I'm about 6 years in, right? I think I was numb and in survival mode for that first 2.5 years. I was just taking care of the kids and figuring out life and what does this all look like. I don't think I actually faced my grief or the true feelings around it till about 2.5 years later. Even though I thought I was doing it. I thought I was doing grief. So I'm very interested to see where you lead us today.
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying about not, like, you think you're dealing with your grief, but I don't think you even recognize the emotions you're feeling. Like, you know you're grieving, but there's so many emotions that are so mixed in with each other that separating out, am I feeling fear right now? Or is it anxiety? Or is it sadness? Or what exactly is happening, and what combination of those is happening at any given point is really hard to separate out and to really actually deal with them as the individual feelings that they are. Thank you.
I think for me, it was mostly overwhelm, exhaustion. And everyone kept telling me how my life was so hard and how like a lot of people had feelings to share how I should be feeling. Mm-hmm. So that was also interesting too. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of your life is so hard. I couldn't do it. It's like, what, do you think I can do it? I don't think I can do it either.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for having me.
Yes. Dave, do you want to share?
Yes, I will be more than happy to share. My name is Dave Roberts. I have a master's in social work degree. I'm a licensed master social worker. I am a retired addiction professional and clinical supervisor. I worked for 27 years for the state of New York. And then I retired and found out in retirement I was busier than I ever was working. I'm an author. I'm a blogger. I've done workshops locally and nationally on grief and loss. I have done bereavement support in the past for individuals who have experienced loss of any kind. What got me into the field of death and dying and thanatology, I mean, I'm no stranger to grief. I've danced with loss since I've been 5 years old. But the loss that really got me, that really shattered my world, caused me to take a look at everything I stood for, and eventually helped me to re-engage in a purposeful and meaningful life, was the transition of my 18-year-old daughter, Janine, who transitioned on March 1st, 2003, of alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma, a rare and very aggressive form of cancer. She died 10 months after she was diagnosed. And she died 10 months after giving birth to my first granddaughter, Brianna, who is going to be 20 years old May 2nd. And it's kind of hard to believe it's been that long. For me, you mentioned in terms of just a couple of things about the benefits of facing your feelings. I think when we can do that, we can embrace acceptance, we can embrace genuineness, and we can embrace wholeness. And I'd be one of the people to say that happiness by itself does not ensure fulfillment, that we have to embrace the entire spectrum of our emotional experience. And that includes grief, because we're not going to be able to run away from the feelings that seemingly without control take us over. So if we can face it, we can we can allow those feelings to envelop us and to teach us, we can eventually see that even the most negative feelings have some of the most positive things to teach us. And I'm a firm believer in embracing all of that for authenticity and wholeness.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much for sharing and for being here with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Autumn. And Jenny also got me hooked up with the Global Grief Conference. She's kind of like I think, unappointed official matchmaker for hooking people up in the grief world. So she hooked me up, and I'm glad she did. It's been a great experience.
Great.
So thanks, Jenny.
Jenny, why don't you go ahead and go next?
Okay, I love that you use the term matchmaker, Dave, because I was working with Reimagine. They're a nonprofit organization that does a lot of work with the end of life and death and dying and trauma and adverse situations wherever we find them in our lives. And I was connecting people with them too that I'd met and thought, oh, you two need to connect. You need to connect with Reimagine. So I was playing there as well. And one of the Reimagine staff said, "You're a matchmaker made in heaven." Yes. I love that title. And I claim it. I will absolutely claim it. I'm a people person. And I love people. I love connecting with people. I love hearing people's stories. I do people. That's what I do.
Great.
And so I learn so much from others. And in fact, that's actually how I got into this grief space, was by sitting with a woman, wife, whose husband died suddenly. And I thought it was going to be a 5-minute visit to drop off a meal, but it turned into 3 hours of holding space for her in her grief and her trauma, her vulnerability, and allowing her, like you say, Autumn, to go into that darkness and face her feelings. And that's how I got started in this grief field. I don't have personal experience with major losses to death, but I have learned so much from the stories that I've heard from others who have. Mm-hmm. My major loss is the loss of myself. And I didn't discover that until after I'd started supporting people in their grief.
Well, great. Thank you very much for sharing and for being here with us. And Sarah, who was my matchmaker with this conference, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Sarah Cobb. I'm the founder of My Grief Connection. It's a website and social media platform that's like a hub of grief resources and a growing community of support for grievers. I started My Grief Connection about almost 3 years ago. It was 1 year to the date after I lost my older brother tragically in a murder-suicide, and he was the perpetrator of that. So my life had been turned upside down, and just something that came out of the blue. I had no concept that something like that could ever happen in my family. Although we had also had another huge loss years before, a little bit different context, but still very tragic. So my oldest brother, Stephen, actually died when he was almost 7 in an accidental electrocution. And I wasn't born yet. I was born 11 months after he died. So I was born into a grieving family. And little did I know, 40-something years later, these two experiences would kind of weave together and lead me on a path to my purpose. So kind of crazy how it's all worked out. Yeah. So I guess when we're talking about feelings, I always thought I was a really deep feeler because I'm a very sensitive person, a highly sensitive person, very empathic, easy to cry. I always felt like my emotions were pretty accessible and kind of right there. But when I started doing some counseling after my brother's death. I realized I was not as in touch as I thought I was. I think I was thinking my emotions and not feeling them a lot of the time. So I'm kind of a head person. I actually have a background in library science and worked at a library for many years and do library reference. And so that plays into why I like to search out resources and help connect people with resources with my grief connection. But I think I'm a thinker, I'm like always thinking and always taking in information and reading and stuff like that. So my counselor would ask me about how I felt, and I would be like, I think I feel like, and so it took a little while for me to get out of that, get out of my head a little bit and start to get into my emotions. And it's been really, really transformative and extremely helpful. It's still a work in progress, I think. I still have to undo some of my thinking habits from the past and kind of going to that place, and I have to give myself some time and stillness and space to sink into my feelings a little bit, to really let them come up and to dig a little deeper and not just that surface level of exploration, but getting more curious about what's the feeling under the feeling. And I think that's been really, really helpful in my grief process.
Yeah. So just for our format, I'm going to get into sharing my thoughts on it here in just a minute, but I would like it. Feel free, any of you guys, to jump in. If you're watching through one of the streaming things, throw in comments. I'm keeping track of those because I really think it's important to have the discussion. I can stand in front of you guys and talk all night, but I don't want to because I don't think it's as beneficial. It's so much more helpful to talk while you're processing. So feel free, if you have any comments, just to jump on in there. Sarah, you said something interesting that is related to this and as part of grief, but you said you didn't expect it to happen to you or your family. And I think that's one of the things that's really common with most people that grieve is we don't expect it to happen to us. It happens to other people. Other people's family members get cancer, or they're in car accidents, or whatever tragic circumstances is that happens and people die, but that's other families. And it's a little bit silly that we tend to have that mentality because everybody dies. You're gonna deal with grief at some point in time. And we all want it to be when we're older, but does that make the grief when a grandparent dies, if you're close to them, any less just because it's happening later in their life? And it really doesn't. And I think as hard as it is to some degree, and maybe not embracing might not be the right word, but recognizing that we are all going to die at some point. Our kids are going to die. Our spouses are going to die. People are going to die around us. So why don't we prepare ourselves the best we can to deal with that moving forward as much as possible? So I mentioned that I'd lost my husband and then I lost my cousin. Right after I lost my husband, my mother-in-law got a group counseling session together for me and her and my husband's dad, and they were divorced at that time, and his brother. So 4 people with very different personalities, all in a grieving session a week after my husband randomly died at 30. It did not go well. I mean, it might have. I was not in a place. I went because I was asked to go, and it was easier than saying no. And we sat down on the couch, and we live in a very small town. She knew what had happened. And the first thing she asked us was, how are you feeling? And I thought that was the most ridiculous question. My husband died a week ago. How am I feeling? I'm feeling horrible. And I shut down. And I had no desire to look for any other sort of therapy or counseling or any other help, because if all they're going to do is ask me how I'm feeling when it should be very clear that I'm not doing great, I didn't want to participate. And it wasn't until after my cousin had died, months after my cousin had died, that my sister reached out to me and she goes, I found this really good life coach and I really think you should give her a shot. She really helped me and I think she'll help you, and just give her a shot. And I did. And I'm so thankful I did, because I am not a sharer. I do not like talking to people about my feelings, which makes it a little funny that I'm doing what I'm doing now. But I'm not a sharer. I don't want to open up. I don't want to talk about things like that. And so I never realized how helpful it is to have somebody to talk to about that sort of things and change your perspective and give you a different lens to look through. And it really helped me. And one of the sessions we had was about me being so tired all the time because I'm just trying to deal with life, in this life I didn't want. And I was so exhausted, and I could not have these meltdowns. I'd be living my life and I'd just have these meltdowns, and they were horrible, and I didn't want to do them anyways, and please fix me. And she looked at me and she goes, "What happens when you have the meltdowns?" I said, "Well, I feel horrible and I don't want to feel horrible." She goes, "Yeah, but what happens when you get back up? 10 minutes after you're done, whether it takes a few hours or it takes a day, what happens when you stand up?" And it took me a while to get there, but it's like, you know what? I feel a little bit better. And that was really eye-opening to me. And so I got to kind of thinking about it a little bit. And I felt like I was running a lot. I felt like I was in this marathon that I just was not getting through. And I lived in sorry, I'm skipping through my slides too quick. I lived in this gray fog all the time. And Allison, you mentioned that for the first few years, you felt like you were just trying to survive and do what you needed to for your kids. And that's very much what I was doing. I was just doing what I needed to. And it was so exhausting because everything made me want to cry. Everything was hard. Everything made me want to break down, but I wouldn't. I'll deal with that later. I'll have 5 minutes in the shower between kids where I can maybe cry for a few minutes, and I'll schedule it in. And I just wouldn't. I'd go to the grocery store. People would talk to me. I'd just shut down. I wasn't going to feel any feelings. I was not going to give myself place or time to do that. And I didn't. And I was always exhausted because I felt like I was running from this monster, of emotions, because I was scared that I wouldn't be able to come back from them. Even though I did crash, and I felt like on occasion this grief monster caught up with me. And then I'd feel better. I'd feel lighter. I'd feel a little bit renewed, and I'd be able to go back to running my marathon up this giant hill. And what I'd learned was, if I stop running, if I have that moment, if I have that trigger and I face it and I acknowledge it, I deal with it and I feel it, I don't spend so much time running, and I have a lot more energy to give to myself and to my kids and to this life I was trying to create. And so if this was an in-person workshop, what I'd normally have people do is think about what it looks like to you when you're running from your grief. So I guess I'll just put that question out to you guys. I think it's normal for us not to want to cry in front of people. So we try to hide it. We say we'll do it later. Do any of you guys want to share any situations where maybe you ran from your grief a lot? Or on the other hand, if you're really good at giving yourself that time to stop and feel it?
I am loving these synchronicities, divine connections, whatever you want to call them. You're talking about running a marathon. And a couple years ago, I was running a marathon, not necessarily in grief or from grief, but I was doing so many things professionally, personally. I have 5 kids. So when you see my little one, that's why. But I just had I had so much going on that I felt like I was running a marathon. And I knew that as soon as I stopped, I would crash, because I've had experience with that before. And I knew that when I crashed, that would be a huge grief wave. And so I knew that this grief wave was coming. And I was kind of starting to panic. And I reached out to my therapist and said, "What do? I see this wave coming. I'm going to crash." He gave me the most profound advice that I've ever heard. He said, let it come.
And I think that is really the key. I think it's hard to do because you know it hurts to go through and to really feel those feelings, but you can't run from it. Everybody wants, like, it would be great if you could just get over your grief and you have your 6 months of proper grieving time and you wear your black clothes and then all of a sudden it's better and you get to carry on with your normal life. And in reality, there's no going back. There's no getting over your grief and there's no normal life left for you. You get to make a new normal, a new life. And so it's hard to stop and face those emotions. Dave, did you have something?
Yeah, you were asking kind of any kind of situations in terms of where I ran from my feelings. And for me, I was thinking of two analogies. One, and this is a friend of mine who's also another grief worker, said it's kind of like when a dog gets bit, they run around in a circle to try to outrun the pain, and then eventually they just collapse from exhaustion. Because you try to outrun it, you try not to deal with it, it's just going to catch up with you anyway, you're just going to crash. The other thing is, for me, one of the things I would try to do a lot to suppress my feelings, and that's for a lot of different reasons. But one of the things I found out, and I saw this analogy in a book by Debbie Ford called Dark Side of the Light Chasers, where she adopts Carl Jung's work with the shadow element. Jung defined shadow as a person you would rather not be. And she developed a whole series of exercises and meditations to help individuals embrace wholeness, embrace the totality of who they were. And one of the object exercises that she had that I thought was profound is she said, take a beach ball, and I'm paraphrasing this, let that beach ball be your grief. Suppress it in water and see what happens when you just let up on the ball just a little bit. We can only suppress it for so long, that ball's going to come back up. And the analogy I use with my students, because I am an adjunct professor as well at Utica University in Utica, is that you can have a lot of your friends who want to see you be happy and not grieve anymore, push down on that ball with you. But when somebody lets up, that ball's going to pop up. So the message is very simply this: if my grief isn't going to go away, the anger associated with grief or sadness isn't going to go away, you might as well deal with me and let me teach you something. And once I began to realize that I could embrace my shadow and I could learn from all of those qualities that people said are not okay to have because they're not happiness, then I began to find peace, and I began to embrace who authentically who I was post my daughter's transition.
Yeah. And Dave, you said something that I wanted to touch on, where you said none of your friends wanted to see you grieve. Mm-hmm. So that's something I've started realizing in the last year or so, was we live in a culture that wants to fix everything. We want to make people feel better. Even me, as somebody who's grieved, who knows you can't fix grief, when I have a friend that loses somebody close to them, I want to make them feel better. I just do. It's part of this culture, mm-hmm. especially in the US, that we really have. We're fixers. We want to put a Band-Aid on it and make everything better and expect you to be better.
Yep.
And I think other people put those expectations on us, which is why they think you should be doing good by now. It's been a year. It's been 2 years. Why are you still grieving? And I think we also tend to put that on ourselves. Well, I have to be strong. I can't show weakness. I can't cry. I need to be strong for X, Y, and Z reasons. Mm-hmm. And I don't think grieving or crying or letting your feelings be felt is a weakness. I think it's actually, for me personally, because I'm not a sharer and I'm not very in touch with my feelings, that actually took a lot of strength to allow myself to have that connection with my feelings and actually feel them. Mm-hmm. And so I think we have a little bit of a misconception in our culture that hopefully, as grief becomes a bigger conversation, we can start to change. Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to butt in. Sorry, I have to hop off. Thank you so much, Autumn, for everything. I'm actually going to hop onto the speaker channel and do my my part. So
Great.
thank you for having me.
Yep. Thank you,
Enjoy the
Jenny.
rest of your time.
Great.
Thanks, Jenny. Bye-bye.
So one example I have of feeling my feelings, and this is the first one I can think of, and it was probably about 3 years after my husband passed away. And my family and I were sitting in church, and one of the older members of the congregation tripped as she was walking to her seat. Bad enough that she could not move. We had to call an ambulance. And I was fine. There were people were helping her. I was sitting right next to her. I was fine until I heard the ambulance come. And at that point, all of a sudden, I was back on the side of the road with my husband, waiting for the ambulance to come and hearing the ambulance come. And it all came back to me. And I'm sitting in this place, and I had already realized that I needed to feel my feelings, but I hadn't really put it into action yet. And what I wanted to do, as I started to feel the tears come to my eyes, was go to the bathroom. Go somewhere where nobody could see me and I could just hide and I could get myself under control and I could go back out there and it'd be fine. And what I did instead was I grabbed a box of Kleenex and I sat there and I let my tears come. And I didn't draw attention to it because I didn't need to, and it wasn't about me. There was a woman that was hurt that very much needed everybody's attention. I didn't want to take anything away from her, but I also didn't want to take anything away from me by hiding that this was a big situation for me that was really hard for me to deal with. And rather than suppressing that and then continuing to suppress it throughout the day, right? Because once you go to the bathroom and you get your tears under control, you may physically look fine, but you're holding that anxiety and those feelings into you. And at least for me, when I do that, that's something I carry with me all day or into the next day for who knows how long. And so that was one of the first times where I really stopped and I recognized, okay, I'm more or less having a flashback to when I was working on my husband on the side of the road. I'm having a lot of anxiety because I'm worried that this woman may not make it. There's also fear associated with that loss. And so I was able to kind of work through my feelings, be like, I'm obviously upset, so why am I upset? And I think that's one of the big things is to recognize why you're upset. And then the second step I think that's important is to name the feeling you're feeling. So that's one of my first examples. More recently, it was earlier last year. It was during COVID, but we were in a situation where I live where we were going into the office a little bit. And we had a meeting in the office. And I realized as I was driving into that meeting, about 10 minutes before it started, that my husband's 6-year death anniversary was coming up. And I completely lost it in the car on my way to a work meeting. And I started to panic as I was driving because I didn't have time to deal with it. I don't want to feel these feelings. I can't do this right now. And so I went back to that old instinct almost to try to hide it, try to suppress it. And by the time I made it up to my office, I decided that I was going to go and talk to the person who was running the meeting, who was my boss at the time, and say, so this is happening. I'm having an emotional moment. It has to do with me. It has to do with things I'm going through. I'm barely holding it together right now. I'm probably not going to really try to hold myself together, but I'm going to go in our meeting. And if I break down and I feel like I'm being a distraction, I will leave. And what I found by going in and telling him that and saying, hey, I'm having a grief day. I'm having a hard time with this. That during the meeting, even though I was still having a grief day and I was still feeling emotions, I didn't have the pressure of having to hold myself together on top of all of that. And so I gave myself permission by basically saying, hey, I might cry in our meeting. It has nothing to do with what's going on at work. So just ignore me. And if it's too bad, I'll walk out. And taking that pressure off of my shoulders and giving myself the permission to be okay with grieving and being okay if other people know it, it wasn't even an issue. I didn't have the greatest day that day, but I didn't force myself to not feel my emotions. And I didn't try to hide them from other people. And by giving myself that freedom, it really took off a lot of pressure, and it made it easier for me to carry on with my day and actually have, by the end of the day, have a pretty good day. So the steps I really think are important for feeling your feelings is recognizing it, recognizing the emotion, naming the emotion, facing it, feeling it, letting it out, whatever that is. And our emotions are everything. I've been talking a lot about crying and tears, but anger is another one. So there's healthy outlets for all of these emotions. Exercise is a great one for anger. Going out and yelling is a great one for anger. There's healthy ways to release even some of those emotions that are traditionally considered negative. And then let it go. So by naming it and letting it out, it's a lot easier to be like, okay, I've dealt with that. I don't need to hold on to it. I don't need to make myself deal with it later and carry it with me until I can deal with it, because now I felt it and I can let it go and I don't need to worry. It'll come back because it always does, but I don't need to carry it with me. So the concept of feeling your feelings, I don't think it's so much as feeling them as it is giving yourself the permission or having the courage to turn around and face them. So instead of running from your feelings while you're always looking over your shoulder, my biggest recommendation is, when you can, to stop and just let them come. Does anybody have a situation or an example where they were really able to feel their feelings, or they thought they did really good handling the feelings that may have come up suddenly? Dave.
Yeah, I can. There's a couple things you were talking before I get into that, just briefly, that I want to address that spurred a couple thoughts. I used to run a support group meeting we used to have in our area. And by the way, I'm from upstate New York, Whitesboro, New York, very rural area, pretty much probably like where you are in Oregon, Autumn. And we used to have a Compassionate Friends support group, which Compassionate Friends exists to support families who have experienced the death of a child of any age, of any cause. And one of the norms that we had in group was crying was allowed. And I would tell the participants, I have tissues. And I said, as far as I know, the flood insurance is paid. So as far as I'm concerned, if you need to just let it out, let it out. You be wherever you need to be emotionally in that moment. If you want to sit and you want to cry, do it. I think and the other thing that I think when you said that with your boss, I think was that struck a note for me, is that there's freedom in being vulnerable, that you felt vulnerable, but you trusting him enough to let him know, hey, I'm not having a good day. I'm probably going to break down. And if I do and I'm a distraction, I'll leave. So you owned it. You were vulnerable with it. And therefore, that took the weight off you. And I think when we acknowledge our fear of anything, our fear of emotional breakdown, that fear no longer has a hold on us. If we call that fear in and we hold on to it, we're going to manifest what that fear is going to manifest. For me, one of the things that I struggled with was during my daughter's illness. And I had a therapy session. If you wanted to know how not to do a therapy session, this would be it. We were ordered, we had a doctor's order to have the psychologist, who was kind of the consultant psychologist for the hospital, meet with my wife, Sherry, and me, and about how we were feeling about Janine's illness. And I knew how I was feeling about it. I knew that it was a bleak situation based on her prognosis. But for the entire session, she focused on my wife, never asked me how I was doing, never asked me for, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? So basically, I'm looking, I say, okay, maybe I'm chopped liver, I don't know, but I did not leave with the great, and I'm a therapist. I used to be a therapist by trade. And I told my wife, I said, that's one and done with her. She's done. So I remember I was sitting after with Janine after chemo, and she would get her chemo at night, and so she could sleep. And I was sitting there with my head between my hands, or my thinking of, just feeling lost, feeling dark. I felt really kind of disenfranchised at that point with my own grief and my own longing. And a nurse came up to me. Her name was Mary. I'll never forget her. She looked at me and said three simple words. She said, "Are you okay?" And I almost lost it right then and there. And I tried to hold it together, but I did lose it a little bit. And I said, "Yeah, I'm okay." And I was okay because she asked me if I was. And that was the first person there that validated my struggle in terms of what I was going through. And that gave me permission to at least, feel what I was feeling at that moment.
Yeah. I think we often expect men to not feel things as deeply. And a lot of times the focus, especially if it's a joint loss of a child or something like that, the focus is on the mom or on the woman's side of it. And I think that's something that we really need to work on, that it's really a bias that women need more help and men can hold themselves together. And I think that also leads to a lot of men internalizing their feelings a lot more. And now that's fine if that's how the men grieve, and they might not want to talk about it, but to pretend that they don't grieve is a whole nother situation.
Yeah, and if I may add one more quick thing to that, because I think men, we feel feelings as intensely as women do. And I really do, but many men just handle the feelings differently. We may not emote, we may work our way through our feelings. I know for a lot of guys who are cognitive thinkers, and when Sarah had mentioned, about thinking through grief, one of the things that it occurred to me is I can ask a guy, tell me what you're thinking. Now, if that guy says, well, geez, this really sucks, and I might get that kind of response. Okay, tell me how it feels to have it suck. What feelings does that statement emote for you? And so basically, I think we can get to a guy's feelings through their thoughts. A lot of men don't have a natural vocabulary of feelings or something they can access directly. Many men don't. But if you ask them what they're thinking, then we can find out how they're feeling based on what feeling that thought evokes. So that's just something kind of I've learned through my own experiences and, going through my own journey. And I'm very open about talking about how I feel, but I wasn't always like that. But you can ask me what I was thinking, I could tell you, and then the feelings would come. And somebody can ask me what I'm feeling, I can do that directly because I've developed that vocabulary, that feelings vocabulary based on my own challenges.
And that's great advice. And I think it can be applied to a lot of other people. So it was great. Sarah, you mentioned that you tend to be you understand your feelings. You thought you were in touch with them and you've learned to be even more in touch with them. I was not that way. As far as I was concerned, if you cried, you were weak, but I've always been very logical about things. So sometimes that's a good way to get into anybody or get anybody who may be grieving talking, is to not ask how they're feeling, because it's so easy just to be like, fine. And that's it. That's the answer. But if you ask them what they're thinking, it opens the door a lot more. Allison, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say I've also had the experience where I've heard feedback that sometimes people are afraid to ask how you're feeling or thinking because they think it might either hurt you, right, to remember your loved one or to have these feelings. And then also it triggers things in them too, right? It triggers their memories, their emotions. Like they seem to really, well, we all do this. We go back to our own map and our own experiences. Like I have an experience where I was checking into the hospital just for a routine procedure. And the admin person asked me my marital status. And I was there for I'm not going to get into details, but a feminine checkup. And I was like, what does my marital status have anything to do with this? But I was like, I'm a widow. And she was just like, oh my gosh, you're so young. And she just went off on how she feels about that potential, because the fear, I find in my experience, we step back and we're like, oh my God, imagine, what if my partner died? What if I lost my partner? What if I lost my child? What if I lost my parent? And So even to ask that question, it's like, am I diving into this world where now I've got to I've got to either live my own, or, you know what I mean, go into this uncomfortable. So some people, though they might, you know, be okay with asking you from your perspective, may think you may carry those emotions or need that, but they might be terrified as to what will come back at them.
Yeah. And I think that's a good thing to point out is, have any of you guys ever been in a situation where, for whatever reason, whether it's something like you just explained, where somebody asks your marital status or how many kids you have or something like that, and all of a sudden you tell them, but now you feel like you're in the position to have to comfort them because they're so traumatized by what you just shared.
I know, that was exactly my experience. I just sat there, and because, you know, I was a little further along on my grief journey, right? I was 4 or 5 years in, but I just kind of sat there and I'm like, oh gosh, like here I am trying to check in at the hospital, and and now I'm comforting the admin person. And I'm like, I don't even know why my marital status, I even said that. I'm like, don't you just need my emergency contact? Like, why do you need to know if I'm married? This is really interesting. But yeah, there was definitely a role reversal there. I was like, oh, now I'm comforting her. This went, you know, in a whole different direction than I thought.
Yeah, which again is because we want to fix things, right? So you're comforting her because she feels so uncomfortable about your story, because we want to fix her. We don't want her to be uncomfortable. And that brings up another point. Like Dave, you mentioned that in your support groups, you always make sure you have a lot of Kleenex. And in some of the widow groups I've gone to, they always make sure there's a lot of Kleenex. And a lot of times, what I've been told at the conferences is we make sure there's Kleenex everywhere, so you don't have to offer Kleenex to somebody. Because once you offer it to them when they're in the middle of talking or they're in the middle of feeling and they need Kleenex, you're disrupting that. You're not just giving them something to use for their tears, you're trying to stop their tears. And I always thought that was an interesting concept. And I could see how that might be the case with some people and it might not be the case with other people. But it's something I always have in the back of my mind now when I'm talking with people. It's like, should I offer them Kleenex? And I usually wait to see, like, if they're looking around like they're looking for something, then yeah, I'll push something a little bit closer, but I might not verbally offer it to them. One other thing I think is really hard is, so you're feeling your feelings, whether you're crying or not. Crying's the easiest example, so that is the one I go back to. Don't apologize for it. Have you guys gone into your feelings and then all of a sudden you're in front of people and you're like, I'm so sorry, I can't,
I actually wrote that down. I was like, I don't know if it's because I'm Canadian and we say sorry all the time. We're always apologizing. But yeah, like, that's one thing I've stepped into now. If I'm feeling an emotion, I don't apologize for it anymore. You know, I don't apologize to say I'm crying. Like, I'll say, you know, I need a minute, or I feel a little overwhelmed. Like, sometimes I'll give an explanation so that someone knows if I need more care, right? Like, at that moment. But I consciously decided to stop apologizing if I needed to cry.
And that was something I stopped doing too. And it's hard because you want to care that other people feel bad, because people don't like to see other people cry. But when you do that, you're shutting down your feelings again. If you're apologizing for crying, you're basically saying, I'm doing something wrong, and so I'm going to apologize for it. And grieving and feeling your feelings isn't doing something wrong. It's actually more healthy than anything else. Sarah, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel with you all about the Kleenex situation and the apologizing for crying thing. I definitely have fallen into that trap a lot, and I have to work on it. Because, like I said, I am an easy crier, so I'm just constantly crying. I don't really have a problem crying in front of people, even strangers in general. But when it's hard for me is when I can't speak. It's usually when I'm trying to talk. and share something about my story, and then I get all like, I get so choked up that I can't talk, and so then I apologize because I'm like, oh, I can't get my thought out, and I know I'm getting better. I'm getting better at it, and definitely get to practice with my counselor a lot. But even still with her, I've gotten to where I'm pretty good about not apologizing when I cry in therapy. But just the other day, I was crying and I was saying sorry, and she was like, "Don't apologize," like tears are okay. And I'm like, I know, but I don't know. It's just so ingrained. Like I can't help it for some time. And maybe part of it is the female conditioning too. Like just trying to, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, being seen as weak by other people, I don't really think that crying is weak at all. I think it actually takes a lot of strength to show your emotions and to be vulnerable. But we get so many weird mixed messages from society about about our emotions that it's hard not to kind of take those on sometimes. And yeah, but I think it's healthy. I've actually read a couple books about tears and crying and about how actually therapeutic and healing they are, how we release hormones, when we cry, we release stress hormones, and it's super healthy and therapeutic to let those tears out. But it is frustrating sometimes when it does come at inconvenient times. That's where I get more frustrated, when it's just like, I don't mind crying, I just don't want to do it right this second, in front of this person, or just in this situation, or because I'm trying to get something out and I can't when that happens.
Yeah.
That's where I kind of get frustrated. But yeah.
I completely agree. It looks like we have somebody new with us. Hi, Tony. Do you want to introduce yourself really quick?
Yes, I do. I'm Tony Lynch. I'm under West.
You're pretty quiet. Can you get closer to your mic?
Can you guys hear me now?
Yep.
Much better.
Okay. Yeah, I am Tony Lynch. I'm the founder of Memories of Us and one of the co-hosts of this amazing bit this weekend. And when I heard you guys talking, I was like, they're talking about language. I wonder if I could jump on there with them. And so I've been listening to everything, and I was like, man, that's I just wanted to be a part of this. So thank you guys for allowing me to be a part of the panel today.
Well, we're glad you were able to jump on with us. Allison, you mentioned not apologizing, but still offering some explanation. And I really appreciate that, because sometimes, depending on where you are, you don't need to do any of that. But sometimes if you're in the middle of a work meeting or something else, you might have to, it's weird just to sit there and cry and not say anything and not expect other people to freak out. So if you can quantify it a little bit or turn it around and say, I just need a minute, excuse me, you're not apologizing, but you're still helping the situation be a little bit easier, especially for some of the other people. Which again, other people are not our responsibility.
I was going to say that. Other people's opinion about what you're going through is not our responsibility. What you're is your responsibility, because you are in charge of you. You are in charge of taking care of yourself, emotionally, physically, spiritually, and all those different areas. So, when it comes down to, especially if you work at a job, if you're working at a job and they understand and they have a sort of understanding of what you've gone through, then the job should provide, resources for you, instead of expecting you to come in and perform at 100% when 60% of your life has been destroyed. And so in order for us to get it back up to that 100%, let the job should know, right? But let them know that, hey, right now, I'm not in a good place, and I don't want to do something that's going to put a bad mark on me. But right now, what I'm going through, can I control? If I have a burst, outward burst of something in a meeting or anything like that, I do it unapologetically. I really do. I do it unapologetically because, for one, denying my grief is going to be dangerous to me in the long run, because eventually, if I ignore it, it will come out. It's going to come out. It's going to wreak havoc on everything that I am. So, when it comes to jobs, and I tell, I do a mindfulness group for those as well. I inform jobs that if you want your employee to perform at the level that they need, provide somewhere that they can go and actually be able to talk about what's going on. Just like if you go to school, right? They got counselors. They got counselors and stuff there, right? So why should it be any different when it comes down to your job? It's that is going to be part of your life. And that job, I feel, should provide some sort of resources for you to be able to go and talk without having to come out in a louder way. So yeah, unapologetically is the way to go. I don't make excuses. I just have to deal with it. If you want me to perform at 100%, this is what it's going to take for me. And I'm not going to apologize if it comes out in front of everyone. I really don't. And as a man, I know we was talking about that earlier. It's kind of strange, right? Because we're taught not to do these things. But those of us who are in tune with that, we understand that when this thing comes, I need some space to be allowed to grieve. I need some space to allow to address those issues and be a better man. Regardless of what anyone else thinks. Your perception is not your perception and your opinion of me is not my problem. It really isn't. I'm doing this to better me, to be healthier.
Dave, go. I feel like you've got something you've been trying to say.
Well, there's a few things that have been going through my head. You asked about apologizing for crying. Interestingly, when I used to facilitate support groups, there would be parents occasionally who would, in the support group, and even though they knew that crying and any other type of emotional expression was welcomed, they would still apologize for crying. I said, there's no need to apologize here. We understand that. What you've gone through is the worst possible loss that a parent can go through. What we want is for you to authentically express your emotions. For me, I don't apologize anymore for how I'm feeling. People who know me are going to get my yin and my yang. They're going to get, everything. They're going to get the happy moments that I experience, and they're also going to get the authentic, sad, and pensive moments that I experience. So they know that. And if they want to roll with me, they're going to have to take all of me. And if they don't want to roll with me, they can empower themselves to take a break from me, and I'm fine with that. It's just, but the thing we don't do enough in grief is empower ourselves to feel our feelings without qualifying why we're feeling them. And we don't empower ourselves enough to take care of ourselves. And we don't do that enough because we're buying into a lot of society's expectations that long-term expression of emotions gets in the way of us being super productive. For me, I think embracing that makes us more productive. It makes us more whole, and it makes us more apt to be able to bring people together in a community that values vulnerability and authenticity.
Yeah, and the workplace situation is hard. And my job, I've been blessed to be in a work environment that's been really supportive of my grief, even when I was trying to hide it more. And the situation I brought up earlier, where I said I went into my boss's office, was an interesting situation because I live in a small community. The people I work with are part of the community. 99% of them know everything that's happened to me. At that point in time, I had the person I had to go talk to was somebody who was on a detail from a different area. And so he had no idea what was going on. And I walked in and I said, I just realized my husband died like 6 years ago and I'm having trouble with this. And this is how it's going to be. And he had no idea how to react. And luckily he chose to react with kindness and just said, okay, thank you for sharing that. But there are situations where employers aren't as supportive, or they don't react the same way, or they say, well, you better pull it together because you have a job to do. And I haven't had to experience any of those situations personally. Have any of you guys had to deal with that? I've heard stories, but they aren't mine to share.
Yes. Yes. A long time ago when I was driving trash truck, that's when my son passed away. And so I had a couple of weeks off, which that is not enough. That is honestly not enough to grieve the loss of a child. And they expect me to come back to work. Well, I eventually did have a mental breakdown. And they were like, well, you're just going to have to man up. And when they said that, I turned around and looked at them. I said, according to whom? According to you? I was like, you don't care nothing about me. If I was to leave this job today, you would have me replaced. So why should I have to man up to go out and make you money? Oh, I was so mad. I was so angry. I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And they were like, well, it's your job. I said, well, I'll tell you what. Here's the keys to the truck. I'm going home. You guys can call me later if you want me to come back. If not, I'm not even going to worry about it. So, and had I not been angry in that moment, I probably wouldn't have did anything like that. I would have tried to restrain myself and the things that I was saying. But I think that was like my aha moment. Like, no, you don't care nothing about me, and this is important to me. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to man up for you. As a matter of fact, that word that you just said, I'm about to throw out the window because it's doing a lot more damage than it does good. I shouldn't have to man up for you or anyone else because you don't understand what I'm going through, And honestly, I had to look at it from a different perspective as well. I had to look at it from the side that they're coming from, and I understood why they said what they said, and it was because they had not experienced anything like that, and nor would I have asked them to, have some sort of relation to that sort of grief, So it's going to take a while for people to understand grief in its totality, but also when it comes down to when you go on it, if you have a corporate job or anything like that, they should have something in place for you. They really should. If they want you to come in and work for them and things like that, then they should have something in place to keep you healthy and every aspect of that. Have support in place for those moments, because even if you're dealing with trauma, if that was to come out in the workplace, what you're going to do? Tell me to man up,
Yeah.
We see how that works out, right? It doesn't work out too well, and so helping them to understand the people that are working for them, provide something. You want them to be at their best. Provide space for them to be at their best.
And I think that's so true. And part of the reason I do think it's so hard for people to fully embrace their feelings when they're feeling them, which is, in my opinion, the best time to embrace them and feel them, because then you're not carrying them around at all. You just feel them, and then you can take a little bit of a break. But the fear of the reaction of work, or feeling like you need to be 100% professional all of the time. Mm-hmm. So you don't want to feel your feelings in those moments, or you're nervous about how your employer will react because you've never had those conversations. And like I said, I was really blessed with an employer, but they still didn't, there were no conversations about it. I was able to take about 3 months off after my husband died, which was amazing. And it worked out great. And when I went back to work, by the time I got my kids ready for daycare and I got dressed and I did everything else, I could not put on shoes. So I went to work dressed, face washed, wearing a pair of slippers. And they were moccasin looking like slippers. They had soles on the bottom, but they were still very clearly slippers. But that's all I could do. And not one person in this office that was really supportive, and that was a great community, ever came up and said, so I see you're wearing slippers. Do you want to talk about something, or are you struggling with anything? Everybody completely ignored it. I ended up wearing slippers longer than I needed to, just because I wanted to see if anybody would ever actually say anything to me about it. And nobody did. So they were both supportive, but also it was easier for people to ignore my grief if I didn't bring it up to them. And so really having those conversations in the workplace have really helped me, I guess, and hopefully my employer, to be a little more understanding of grief and understanding of the processes. And I've also, since I've been able to take that pressure of having to hold myself together in work off me, I've been able to be a better employee, because when I'm having a bad day, I can deal with it right then. And I don't let that depression and that weight weigh me down for days and days and days and weeks and weeks and weeks, and let my productivity be near zero because I can barely function. Where giving myself permission to grieve, giving myself permission to feel bad, giving myself permission to cry, letting my employers know when I'm having a bad day. I may have a day of low productivity or a few hours, but I'm able to get back up a lot easier than I was before. So, go ahead.
No, I was saying totally understandable, and I was just thinking about it from a different perspective, you know. And for men, we don't really get that. We really don't. We get ignored majority of the time, and that's something that needs to change. You know, it's good when everybody has that equal opportunity to be able to go and express themselves. But men, we don't get that. We in a lot of cases we don't get that consideration. We honestly don't. And then no matter where I've gone or people I've been around, it's always been the same thing. You know, we either get ignored to a point to where when we say things, people often overtalk us because they don't want to hear what we got to say, or they blow us off because, again, they don't want to hear what we got to say, right? You know, they're like, yeah, man, you'll be okay. So it's as soon as we start expressing ourselves, we feel invalidated, right? We feel that you're not hearing what I'm going through, even though you've opened up the door for us to be able to come and talk to you. But then as soon as we step into the door, it's partially open. We only get a foot in. You only hear partially of what we say. And so people are often surprised when we make hard decisions, right? Not really hard decisions, when we make aggressive decisions, and you know, and it comes down to suicide.
Yeah.
So those rates go up, whereas our counterparts, as you mentioned, you guys get the time to do it. It's more acceptable. It's more, oh, I understand. We want to be sensitive to your needs. And then it's not reciprocated on the other end. You know, so there's a lot of work that needs to go in there. And it's going to take time, but I'm not quite sure the answer to it, you know, except for advocating for yourself. You know, especially when we feel that if we don't have anyone to advocate for us. And
Yeah.
So we want to be able to have the same opportunities around people that can relate to what we're going through as well, you know, men and women. I think it should be an equal opportunity thing. And to have that individual support when we're going into either the workplace, home, or anything like that, because it's a compilation of things that once we get to a certain point, we make those decisions based on that power. You know what I'm saying? The neglection of our emotions, you know what I'm saying? All the things have taken on a burden and trying to make sure everyone else is. And then there's the arguments, the combativeness, all of these things that come along, the day-to-day life. Once we get to that point, we don't want to hear what anybody else says. We often feel that we're giving people the chance.
Yeah.
You know, we often feel that we do that. We give everyone a chance to be able to want to talk to us, but it's not reciprocated in that area.
Yeah, it's really interesting the differences between how men and women are treated with grief. And it's so embedded, I think, in our culture and how we're raised. Dee, watching on YouTube, thank you, Dee, and everybody else watching. She said, you know, probably men were taught not to talk about it and not to express it as much. And that is largely what we're grown up with. And as a woman, I grew up seeing that boys were taught that boys shouldn't cry, girls can show a little more weakness.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody should be tough. And, you know, I think even on a subconscious level, at least I'm also guilty of that, because I wrote a book about loss, about losing a husband, about losing a child. And when I wrote that book, I thought my main target would be women. And what I've been really surprised to see is the number of men who have reached out to me and said, hey, reading your book really helped me. I felt it spoke to me. And so I had to turn my own thinking and my own processing around and recognize that grief isn't just for women. I'm not just speaking to other people that are my same sex. I'm speaking to people who have lost. And so I'm working on that myself, because it's so easy just to fall back into that, well, we were raised, boys don't cry. Be tough. And that's not how it should be, and it's not fair to you guys at all to have that. Dave, did you have something?
Yeah, I would just to kind of Tony's Tony's comments kind of spurred something in me. And I think, I think there's a legitimate piece that a lot of men's grief can be ignored because we're kind of the impression is that for most men, we're supposed to be able to handle whatever is thrown. That's been kind of the expectation that has been thrown upon us. But the other piece with this whole thing is that, and it gets into feelings. And I think maybe Tony, I don't know, you and I might have had a conversation about this earlier, but a lot of times, or it might have been somebody else, I'm not sure. But a lot of times, men might be concerned or just tell the woman in her life, "Geez, don't cry. It's making me uncomfortable." And I don't believe it's making them uncomfortable for the reasons that we think. But a lot of times men have been conditioned to be the problem solvers, the protectors in the family. And I know from my own experience, after Janine transitioned, whenever I saw my wife Sherry in pain, I saw my kids in pain, it reminded me of what I didn't do as my role as the father protector. I couldn't protect my daughter from her cancer. I couldn't protect my family from their pain. So essentially the emotions their emotions became my emotions. But yet at the same time, how am I going to own that and have somebody understand that? And as you know, in terms, and I don't, in terms of what I talked about earlier, when I was ignored in the therapy session, that was another classic example of how men's grief was ignored. Well, you should be able to handle it. I'm more concerned about your wife. Hell no, I couldn't handle watching my daughter die.
Yeah.
I couldn't handle watching her waste away. And so just because I'm a guy, it means I can deal with this and suck it up and move on? No. And I think we need to understand, I think that everybody's grief is valid. Everybody's grief needs to be honored. We just deal with it differently.
Yeah.
My wife and I grieve very differently,
Mm-hmm.
but we understand it, we respect it, and we work with it and we support it. And if we can do that with each other, the world will be a great place. And we wouldn't have this emphasis on having a super positive, happy society that ignores emotions or devalues emotions if they occur past the prescribed time limit.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And you did something very good. You're like, yeah, I have feelings. I feel like a failure. I feel guilt that I wasn't supposed to do this task. And that's naming your feelings. And it's really hard to recognize that that's what you're feeling sometimes. But of course, feelings like that. When my husband and I were in the hospital with our daughter, we were able to donate her organs. And so what that meant was we were in the hospital for 3 extra days, knowing that she wasn't coming home with us. And we took the time, the hospital was able to give us a family room where we never slept, but we were able to get a few minutes when we needed to. And at one point we laid down and we talked and we said, we'd been married at that point for a few years and together for a few more, but we still talked and we said, how do you grieve? What are you going to do? And he explained what he normally does to grieve. And we'd come together because of our grief. He had lost his father and was able to relate to me losing my husband while understanding that it's a completely different grief. So we'd grown together as friends and then as spouses through grief, but it was still really helpful for us to be able to sit down and say, how are you going to grieve? Okay, this is how I'm going to grieve. And also recognize that neither of us should hide it, because we were really worried with losing a child that it would break our relationship apart. And we didn't want that to happen. So how could we keep that from happening? And part of that was talking about our feelings and recognizing this is what I'm feeling right now. And also one of the conversations we had was no crying in the shower. When my husband had died, I spent a lot of time crying in the shower because I didn't want anybody else to know what was going on. But by making that agreement, it wasn't just no crying in the shower. The agreement we were making was we're going to share our emotions with each other and talk about them. Because if we're trying to hide them and if we're trying to run from them, it's not going to turn out well for either of us. So let's face them as much as we can and do it together. Allison, did you have something else?
I was just going to say it's interesting that I ended up on this with this group of people, because I was, I am an environmental engineer. So at the time when my husband passed away, I was working for a consulting firm, and I'd been there for almost 12 years. So when we're talking about grieving and the emotions that a female or a male would feel, I would put myself more in the male category, to be honest. Like, I find even I'm engaged now, my fiance is the emotional one, the outwardly emotional one. But I was the one, like driving to work and realizing that I was crying in the car, right? I'd be driving to a meeting and I'd be like crying in the vehicle. I'm like, where the heck did this come from? That type of thing. So coming from that, even David mentioned, like, I'm a problem solver. I'm educated as an engineer. That is my job. I solve problems. And I did not solve the problem, right? With my husband experiencing mental illness, alcoholism, and all those destructive behaviors. I didn't solve that problem, right? So then it cascaded into the blame, shame, embarrassment, guilt. It took me a long time to actually feel anger. Mm-hmm. I was always told to be that nice, good girl, right? So that was one question I wanted to throw out to you guys. Like, I'd love to know some of your tools and that type of thing for anger, because anger is that emotion. Growing up as a girl, I was told, like, that's not appropriate. You have to be nice and good and quiet. I was very shy. So when anger hit, especially when I saw what the self-destructive behaviors my husband was going through, I had always said, like, I didn't think he was doing it to anyone else. It was his own inner, I call them inner demons. He was fighting his own inner demons. And I actually think he was trying to protect us. It seems so crazy, right? Because all we wanted him was healthy and to be with us. But I think he was trying to numb some of the things going on. Mm-hmm. And it went into a very destructive path. But yeah, like, so even initially, I remember people saying to me, like, aren't you angry? Aren't you angry at his behaviors? And I could never show that emotion. It took me, again, a really long time, because I wanted to be that nice, loving, good girl, good woman, good wife, right? Mm-hmm. But anger did come up. I was angry. I didn't sign up to have a family by myself. and do it alone.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Anger was also really hard for me. So my husband literally went for a jog. His heart stopped. They don't know why. He literally died on the side of the road. For a 30-year-old man who's a wildland firefighter and an avid hunter and had just gotten home from basketball, he shouldn't have just died. So, and it was late at night. It was dark. And so the police started looking at it as a hit and run. And they later ruled that out. But when it was a hit and run, I'm like, that made sense to me, because I had somebody to be mad at. Right. And I wanted to have somebody to be mad at, because then I had a reason for why he just died. And it didn't take it away, but I had an outlet for my anger. And within 24 hours, we knew that that wasn't the case, that there had been no foul play of any sort involved. And I took that anger, and for the most part, I totally suppressed the anger. The other stuff I dealt with a lot better. The anger, I just completely shut down. And that was really hard. And what I found was my mom stayed with me for the first while after my husband had died, because I was not very functional and I had a newborn. And she stayed, and we'd go to church on Sundays. And that didn't even tell her, but I hated going to church because I felt so much anger at church, because I couldn't be angry at the person who'd killed my husband. Mm-hmm. Except in my mind, God had killed my husband. That's the only person I could be angry at. So going to church in a place where I could have at one point in time found comfort, now I just felt so much anger. And I don't know, I can't remember because I was in such a fog, but at some point in time, somebody noticed. They didn't ask, I didn't share, but they noticed that I was really angry in church. And they more or less walked up to me and said, it's okay to be angry at God. He can handle it. Because not only was I feeling angry, I was feeling guilt over feeling angry. And so that was one of the most powerful things to me, was giving myself permission to feel angry at the person I was angry at. And I was able to release the anger just by giving myself that permission. But it was definitely one that I felt I needed to suppress as well. So that's a really hard part. Anger is a hard emotion to deal with. Fear is also a hard emotion to deal with. And I don't know that there's a ton of, it's going to be whatever works for you as far as an outlet. And sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's something emotional. And there's a lot of unhealthy ways to release anger and to deal with all of these emotions. And so finding that line between a healthy release and an unhealthy release can be difficult for some people also.
Yeah, that's why I was wondering, like, if any of you guys have examples of healthy ways that you've handled your anger.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a couple of things. That first, when you were talking, Allison, about being the problem solver, being the engineer, and thinking in terms of problem solving, I wanted, because a lot of times we tend to categorize and we tend to label, and I as I've gotten older, I try to go away from labels as much. But one of the things, Ken Doka, who was one of the foremost thanatologists of our time, he lives in upstate New York, I think. He wrote an art. He talked about different, for males, that there were intuitive males who would deal primarily from intuition and feelings, and the instrumental male who would deal from the traditional, male model that apparently was ingrained. So there's two, and I'm a firm believer that you know grieving styles, or the way we express feelings, could be a product more of environment and circumstance as well. I mean, 100, in 100% of the cases, males don't grieve the way they're expected to, the way society thinks they should be. There's always room for that individuality. So I wanted to throw that out there, just so, just for everybody, that, Doka did recognize the variability between genders in terms, depending on circumstances, in terms of expression of grief. For me, anger, I mean, I think as Autumn said, it's depends on the individual. For me, journaling helped. I kept a journal during my daughter's illness, during about a year or so after she passed. And it was raw. It had all my anger in it. Plus, the second thing was, and like Autumn, I was angry at God too for dealing me the hands of cards that they had cards that I had to deal with. And one of the things I did is I figured, I didn't realize this at the time, but I owned my anger with somebody who was a member of the church, a nun. And I just basically was a facilitator of my bereavement support group. And I just said, look, I'm angry that I'm angry at God for taking my daughter away from me. And she said something ultimately profound. And she said, what if God is just as upset as you? And that got me to think about that possibility. And one of the things I realized was that I think he demonstrated that, because I was experiencing some real extraordinary, non-ordinary phenomenon, like signs, butterflies, hearing songs on the radio, and I was thinking about her. So that got me to look at my anger differently. The other thing is not to look at anger as a negative emotion. I think we need to validate it. That anger is valid for the situation that we're going through, and also look at the gifts of our anger. Your anger might have given you the energy to set a boundary with somebody who was just interfering with your grief journey. Your anger allowed you to say, this is who and what I'm not willing to experience at this time in my life. Now, it might not have been pretty, but as long as it wasn't destructive form of anger, it may have given you the energy to get through a moment or set a boundary. So in that case, our anger, like anxiety, can be productive. But we also have to take a look at it. And every emotion is not necessarily good or bad. They're good and bad. There's a yin and a yang to it. So what's the gift in our negative emotions? That will allow us to feel them more, because we're going to look for that hidden teaching that's going to contribute to us, again, being whole and authentic and genuine.
And I think those are some great ideas for how to deal with anger. From my standpoint, I don't like to run. A lot of people like to run, but exercise, like a rowing machine or something that was engaging multiple parts of my body where I could do like extra mad pulls and I could be mad at the machines, helped me. But one of the things that really surprised me that helped, and I actually wanted to move into talking about kids a little bit, was working with my oldest son on his grief. So he was 3 when his dad died, and he was 6 when his sister died. And that's a lot of grief for anybody. It's a lot of grief for a kid that doesn't have the language or the feelings. And it took me a while through my grief to recognize that a lot of these anger outbursts that he was having were more than likely tied to his grief. And so we did a lot of work with different people to try to figure out some ways to help him calm his anger down. And some of the things we found were as simple as getting one of those really flimsy plastic disposable water bottles and just crunching it, just squeezing it and making that noise. Another one that was really good was a Kleenex box and just pulling the tissues out. I really like tearing newspaper. And so these are all really messy, but totally harmless ways to just change some of that feeling into a physical activity and help release it a little bit. And so those are a few ideas I have. Sarah, do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I know for me, art was really helpful in my grief process. And so coloring was helpful. And sometimes you can really get out some frustration with those crayons or those colored pencils, or just taking a blank piece of paper and just scribbling, or taking a Sharpie and just making, all kinds of crazy lines and scribbles, just going for it. In that sense, sometimes that can actually help disperse some of that anger. I actually wrote letters, and I found that helpful. I wrote some letters to my brother and to his fiance, expressing, anger and other emotions that I felt for both of them, at what brought their relationship to the point that, this horrible thing could happen. I realized, I was angry at my brother for taking someone's life. I was also angry at him for taking his own life, for letting, feeling like he let his life get so out of control. And also, I started to remember, things growing up from childhood and stuff from his youth. He was kind of a rebel and got into a lot of trouble, caused a lot of stress and anxiety in the family with things that he would do sometimes, or and I started to realize that I was angry about that, about the way that it disrupted our family, and the way that it affected my development growing up. That his actions really had a big impact on me and our whole family. And I, started to feel kind of angry about that, about how, life could have been different and better, maybe. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. I think in the end, things have developed in some good ways, even with what happened. That was horrible. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of anger there for things that happened in the past, not just that specific incident, of murder suicide. So for me, it ended up being helpful to write him some letters to say, like, I'm really angry that this happened when I was younger, or this affected our family. And I don't know if my life would have been different or better if this hadn't happened. And I'm kind of angry that I don't get the chance to find that out, So I don't know. For me, that helped a lot. And I also wrote letters to his fiance, who was the victim in this circumstance. And I know it may sound strange to be angry at her, but there was some anger at her. And I know that people might take that the wrong way, because I don't believe that she deserved what happened, or, of course, that what happened was right at all. But I do understand some of the intricacies of the relationship that took it to a place where what happened could have happened, and she did have a role to play in that, if that makes sense. So there was some anger there, and what happened, what went down in their relationship, some ways that she treated him and stuff. I don't blame her for what happened at all. Now, but there are times when I felt a little blamey.
Yeah.
I felt a little bit like if they hadn't ever started dating, this wouldn't have happened, obviously, or like I wish that I could travel back in time and be like, you guys aren't right for each other, break it up.
Yeah.
But you can't. And I know, even if I did say something, even if I knew kind of what was coming, people are their own. they're they have their own autonomy. They're going to do what they want to do, no matter what you say. And so I don't know. I'm getting a little off track, I guess, about the anger, but I hopefully that helps a little bit. For me, the letter writing was really helpful, and of course, the art part was really helpful as well, and kind of releasing some of that. But yeah, I definitely relate to what you're talking about not feeling like it was okay. It's okay to have anger, or to release it, to express it, at least openly, because of those societal kind of expectations that I definitely grew up with, that good girl mentality that,
Yeah.
we don't talk about those kind of things. We don't express the anger. We should all be just loving and accepting, and all the time, and we should all be perfect, and that's just not reality. So I'm learning to be able to express it more, and try to find healthy ways to let it out. But it is a process, and it's kind of sometimes hit or miss with what works and what helps.
Yeah, these were great suggestions. We were talking a lot about like sadness and crying and that type of thing. And I just wanted to throw anger in there, because those healthy, safe ways to do that are important for everyone.
Yeah, it is. And it's so much. Crying and sadness is the easiest one, right? That's the easiest one to talk about, because on some level, it's also the most accepted one.
Yeah.
Sarah, you brought up being angry towards your brother's fiance. And I think one thing we always want to do is we think about our feelings almost, I don't want to say more than we should, but sometimes if it doesn't logically make sense, we try to convince ourselves we shouldn't be feeling it. And it might not logically make sense to be mad at somebody that had nothing to do with why your person died, or they might have had something to do with why your person died. But the point is, it doesn't matter, right? Because you're feeling that feeling, you're feeling the anger towards them, whether they had any reason for it or not, whether they earned it or not, whether logically you can say, yes, I should be angry at him, or no, I shouldn't, doesn't matter, because you still feel that feeling. And so just recognizing that you feel it, I think, is a really big, important step. And then learning to be okay with feeling it. It can also be very hard. I think anger is a big one. I think another one that I didn't know about really until a little bit after my husband died, but really until after we lost our daughter, was fear. So how much fear grief can give you. And all of a sudden, I had a husband that suddenly died. I had a daughter that suddenly died, both of very rare things. And so all of a sudden, everything is dangerous. Watching my kids go up a slide that's been on this playground since 1930, and nobody has ever died on it, and being terrified that they're going to fall down the ladder and break their neck. It's not a rational fear, but it's still a fear, and it's still my fear. And part of the way I feel those feelings is I do, with fear especially, I do try to logic myself out of it. And that helps me. That's not going to work for everybody. But for me, the first step is I have to recognize it. Okay, I am feeling something here. Kids are at the park. It should be great. Everybody should be having fun, and I'm feeling something. I am not having fun. I'm not enjoying this. What is it? Oh, it's this fear that something's going to happen to them. Okay, so then I've recognized it and I've named it. So what do I do about it? Let's talk through this fear. Is it realistic? Could something happen? Absolutely. Is it likely something will happen? Probably not. Have I taken any reasonable precautions? Yes. I told him not to climb up the opposite side of the stairs. Once I can talk myself down through that, it's really, for me, dealing with fear, that's a process of calming myself down. And I find where I'm fearful, I can make decisions if I need to, if they're reasonable. So if my kids are riding their bike out on the street, okay, yeah, there's a lot of things that can happen when kids are riding a bike. But have I told them how to properly cross the street? Have I told them what to do when a car comes? Are they wearing their helmets? Okay, so I've taken that fear, which can also be healthy. That's what keeps us alive as animals, is fear and control and making smart choices. So have I done the rational, the real ones that are helpful? Okay, so I've taken the precautions that are reasonable. Do I need to tell them they can't ever ride a bike and they can't ever ride a slide or climb up a slide because I'm scared? No, that wouldn't be appropriate. That would be me putting my fear onto my kids and taking something away from them. And so I think both anger and fear are two really big things. And that kind of leads a little bit into a segue of something else I wanted to bring up. Was another thing that I think is really important when it comes to feeling your feelings is if you can figure out how you grieve and you can figure out how to process your feelings and how to feel them either in the moment or as soon afterwards as you can. Our kids learn a lot by watching us. So if you're able to model feeling your feelings, your kids will be able to see that. And in my opinion, that's going to make for healthier grieving for kids, where if you're always processing it, you're always saying, it's okay, I'm okay. No, why are you sad? I'm not sad. Why should I be sad? They're never going to feel like they can say, I'm sad. And with my kids, when their sister died, the youngest was 3. And I really appreciated him because he would be perfectly fine playing in the back seat. And then all of a sudden, he'd just start bawling at the top of his lungs and screaming, I miss my sister. I'm sad because I miss my sister. And it was heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. But at the same time, I was so happy that he was able to express that. And so I really had to work to make sure the 7-year-old was feeling that he could also express it as well. And he did it, like I had mentioned earlier, a lot in anger. And we had to find ways for him to express it as anger, but in a healthier way instead of self-harm, which he did. His instincts were to go to self-harm. He would bend back his fingers till his teachers were scared he was going to break his fingers. There were a few times they caught him hitting his head on the wall at the playground. There were numerous times when he'd say things like, I don't deserve to be alive when she's dead. I should be dead. She should be here. I want to die to see her. And so trying to model what I believe are healthy grief behaviors, I think are really important for our children. And I don't know if anybody has any experience with their kids and grieving and how to model feeling their feelings that they want to share.
I could share a couple of things if nobody else wants to go. And the first thing that when you talked about, your child earlier, the first thing that came into my head was that as children grow, as they go through developmental stages, the meaning that they attach to death is different. As they begin to develop abstract skills and more conceptual skills, grief will tend to recapitulate itself across the adolescent life cycle. So they'll re-express their grief in different ways for the same loss, depending on the level of development they're there. And this happened with my daughter. And she was 10 years old when my mother and my maternal grandmother died. And they were all extremely close. And probably about a couple of years later, she seemed to be okay for a bit. She seemed to have at least gotten through or adjusted initially to the loss. But when she was 12, she started acting out, and she started acting out behaviorally. And come to find out, it was because it was still unresolved grief from her grandmother, and it based on the behaviors that were kind of development specific at that time, or what she was expecting, behaviorally, that's how she manifested. So that's the other part. The other part is, yes, if we can model for our children that it's okay to grieve, we're gonna, and that doesn't have to be necessarily with a human loss. First loss that a child experiences might be a pet. So how we respond to that may also set the stage for how they'll grieve for future losses. So it's anything, any first type of a loss that can occur, we need to, as parents, as caregivers, as legal guardians, we need to be able to model appropriate expression so that they realize that it's okay to feel.
Yeah, exactly. And you're absolutely right with as they develop, they'll grieve differently, and that grief will manifest in different ways. And so my youngest now, sometimes he still cries about missing his sister, but now he's grieving not having any or very few memories of her. And so it's morphed, and it's definitely a different situation. My oldest, who's now 10, he's really struggling with the fact that nobody else that he knows of has lost a father. Nobody else that he knows of has lost a sister, and nobody that he knows of has lost both. And so he's struggling with feeling really alone in his grief right now. And so some of the ways I'm trying to help him with that is we're looking into different grief camps for him, telling him he can talk to us about grief, or where we do know of other kids who have lost somebody, trying to put him in contact so he feels less alone. Because I know for me personally, finding a support community, when I was widowed, which I did through Soaring Spirits, which is an amazing organization that puts on a retreat called Camp Widow, which was amazing for me. And having that community was a huge changing thing. And my kids don't have that. And living where I live, it's much harder. So taking the time and taking the effort to not just model it, but then help them feel their feelings and let them know it's okay to feel their feelings is a really big part of it.
I was going to say my children actually taught me to be in the moment, because like I said, I was kind of numbed out.
Yeah.
And they were 5 and 6 when their dad died, and they would, have a moment of grief. So my daughter created this world where she would go and visit him. Like, she was very much connected to her dad. We also had lost a dog at the same time. So she'd go see her dad and Lola. And she had this special place where she could be with them. Whereas my son went more the anger route. So yeah, there was a lot with that, but even like I said, they would actually show the emotion. So it was great teaching and modeling moments, right? Where I was like, oh yeah, I'm grieving too.
Yeah. And really, it's interesting watching him. And I know it's not this way with all kids, but with the youngest one, like I said, he'd have those outbursts. I'm really sad I miss my sister. And they would last 4 minutes. And then he'd be perfectly happy and go color, which is exactly what I was talking about, right? You feel your feelings and you feel better, where if you're trying to run from them, you're always running from them, and eventually you're just exhausted. And so, yeah, my 3-year-old was really good at modeling that behavior, that I'm feeling this now, I'm going to feel it, and then I'm going to feel better for a while, and I can enjoy things, which really kind of leads into the last point I want to make, which is I think, and again, I'm 7 years out from losing my husband, and I'm still coming up with these things that I'm realizing for my personal grief. But when you're suppressing your negative emotions, you're also suppressing your positive emotions. So if you're trying not to feel because there's so much pain and sadness and anger and fear and hurt, it's really hard to feel those moments of love and joy and happiness and excitement. And so another benefit of really turning around and facing the feelings you're having is you should turn around and embrace all of your feelings. And I really had to practice that early on and almost force myself to feel the happy moments. I had to be like, that's a funny joke, I should laugh, because I didn't want to, because I was suppressing everything. And once I started letting myself be sad, I also found that it was a lot easier to actually laugh at the jokes I thought were funny and to actually enjoy my kids and all these wonderful, amazing points in my life. Because while I have gone through some really horrible stuff that are hard and I'm going to carry it with me always. And I'm always going to grieve. My life is an amazing life. And the only way I can really embrace it is by embracing all the parts of it, the good, the bad, the ugly. Have you guys struggled at all to embrace the good feelings through your grief? Yeah, Allison.
I have. Yeah, I'm actually working with a coach right now on that. Like, I don't know how to have fun.
Yeah.
I feel as though I've been thrown into responsibility full time for years, right? So, you know, I even thought as a kid, I played competitive sports. I was a competitive figure skater, and then basketball, and that. Like, even when I played, I had a role.
Mm-hmm.
I was a mentor. I was a captain. I was competing. I was like, I don't even know how Allison just has fun. So yeah, I'm working on that. I joined the tennis club. I've never held a racket, so we're gonna give it a try. I'm gonna try some fun stuff. But I agree with you. Yeah, when you're focused on like being that responsible person all the time, and then you've had the experience of tragedy and you're used to holding your feelings in, it's all the feelings.
Yeah. Well, and I know for me, going and doing things where I might have to meet new people and I might have to decide whether I say if I have 2 kids or 3 kids, or where I might have to say I was widowed, or if I'm telling a story and I'm like, well, my late husband, and then I see that look on their face and it's like, and so a lot of times I just avoided it. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't want to see anybody. The people who knew me already knew, and I felt like they looked at me like they were pitying me. And so I didn't want to deal with them. And I didn't want to deal with new people because I didn't want to figure out how to answer the questions. And then I realized I can answer the questions however I feel like in that moment. And that's part of really feeling my feelings. If I'm in a situation where it's just easier to say I have 2 kids, then I can say that. If I'm in a situation where I feel comfortable enough to say I have 3 kids, but 1 passed away, I can do that. And both answers are totally acceptable. And being able to really embrace that part has also made it so I've been more willing to put myself out there. And it's self-care too, right? You're always told you self-care and grieving, it's really important. But it's really hard if you don't know how to embrace those good feelings to really care for yourself and to do the things you want to do, whether it's learning tennis when you've never played, or whether it's taking the time to have a bath and to read a book, or whatever you enjoy.
I also think doing that, giving us permission to selectively respond to the question of how many kids do you have, depending on the situation, is also very empowering, and it allows you to be empowered to be the co-creator of your own reality with the universe.
Well, and I think also as part of that is it's feeling your feelings. It's thinking about it. It's recognizing when somebody asks me if I'm married, because it's going to happen. What do I think? What do I want to answer? What does that make me feel when somebody asks me that question? And recognizing that it could make me feel different things because everything is situational, but that it's okay to feel those things. I know I've talked to a lot of people who, if they might say they're not married because they don't want to deal with telling somebody they're widowed, and then they feel guilty about it. It's like, you get to do whatever you need to do in that moment and whatever you decide to do for you. And there's no right or wrong answer. And so being willing to just embrace what you have going for you, I think, is really important. I think we're getting pretty close to the end of our session. Did anybody have any end thoughts before I wrap it up for us?
I just want to say thank you for letting me jump on with you in such short notice. It was wonderful to sit in and listen to everyone and talk about the different areas, especially when it comes down to children and grief. And thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate all the work everybody's put into it. Grief is one of those things where I think we've been doing a lot better as a society and as a culture that are starting to talk more about it, but it's not something most people are comfortable with. So I think most people avoid talking about it, and having these discussions is really beneficial. And you all notice I didn't have much for slides because for me, I get the most out of just having the conversations with people and having the discussions and letting them take you wherever they will, because where those discussions go sometimes is what people need to talk about in that moment. And just having the conversations about grief is so much more beneficial than ignoring it completely. So I've been really happy to be here. Sarah?
Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your story. And every time I hear it, it just really touches me. So thank you. But I also wanted to offer a couple of resources, because that's my jam, that might be helpful, because we're talking about emotions and how to feel emotions and how to name them and recognize them. So a couple things I could suggest is that you can do a Google search for feelings wheel, and you will find some graphics of a wheel with that split up in like different little, pie wedges that has different feelings on it, and shows you kind of the feeling families, the feelings that relate to the core sort of emotions like sadness, anger, happiness. And you can kind of see the nuanced sort of range of emotions. And that can be helpful for you if you're trying to figure out what you feel. Maybe you think you just feel sad, but then you look on there and you realize, no, I'm really feeling melancholy or nostalgia or whatever. It can help give you some vocabulary.
Yeah.
There's a great book I just got recently, actually, called the Dictionary of Emotions, and it's literally just that. It's just literally all of the emotions and their definitions, and that can be helpful to look at something like that, and maybe even pick one of those emotions, read the definition, and then journal about it and write, when in my life have I felt this emotion?
Yeah.
That can be helpful.
Thank you very much for sharing those. And I'm going to cut you off, but Sarah is with My Grief Connection. And if you are interested in other resources, I know she has a ton of them on her website, and she'd be totally happy to help talk to anybody. My website is growingwithgrief.com. I try to list organizations, podcasts, books, whatever that might help people, because when I was grieving, Google didn't work for me and it was really hard to find resources. So I'm just trying to put them all in one place. I did write my book. It's called Boldly Into the Darkness, Living with Loss, Growing with Grief, and Holding On to Happiness. And it's available as a paper book, an ebook, and an audiobook wherever you purchase your books. Support your independent bookstore, or I guess you can buy it on Amazon because it's there too. If you go to my website, growingwithgrief.com, and you enter in the discount code GGC for Global Grief Conference, I will give you 15% off of any of your purchases. And right now, any purchases that are made are going to support a fundraiser to have a fluorograph of my daughter on the Pasadena Rose Parade next year on the Donate Life Float, which is promoting organ donation. So right now there's a really good cause if you want to support me on the website. So I appreciate everybody taking the time to sit in, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your conference.